All right, and we are back here on the GSMC Football Podcast. And for the final part of the show, we will get into ranking the wide receiver groups within the AFC North. Now, if you're new to this, I've been ranking the wide receiver groups as a whole. Not the individual wide receivers within the division. It's the entire wide receiver core. Because I feel like some people have been getting a little confused by that. Because especially with my NFC North rankings, um, there seems to be a little bit of confusion. But it's the entire wide receiving core. So this division was kind of tough. Well, at least 3-4 between the Ravens and the Steelers. For the Ravens, they didn't have a 1,000-yard receiver last year. When I think about the Ravens, I feel like Mark Andrews. Now, again, it's the receivers. So Mark Andrews is not a receiver. He's a tight end. Now, he is a pass catcher, like the receivers, but Mark Andrews is a tight end. So Mark Andrews does not factor into these rankings. So when it comes to the Ravens, Mark Andrews is kind of like the number one receiver in this offense. Now, because he's a tight end, he's not included. So last year, you had Zay Flowers, you had Odell Beckham Jr., Nelson Aguilar. Now, Odell is with the Dolphins, so he's no longer there. They did pay Rashad Bateman, so they're hoping that this year, he really does contribute. Because the top three wide receivers on the depth chart is Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman, and Nelson Aguilar. Zay Flowers last year, 858 yards receiving, 5 touchdowns, had a good rookie season. Rashad Bateman last year, 367 yards receiving, 1 touchdown. Nelson Aguilar, 381 yards and 4 touchdowns. I thought Aguilar was okay for them. He had a touchdown in the playoffs as well. But those are your top three right there. And then they also have Tylan Wallace, who ran back that punt return in the overtime victory over the Rams last year. They also have Deontay Hardy. But yeah, those are your top three. But yeah, with the Ravens though, like I said, Mark Andrews, the tight ends are more of a presence in that offense, and on top of that, I think they're going to be running the ball a ton with Derrick Henry, and Lamar Jackson, of course, will be carrying it himself. And now the Ravens, they did throw the ball more than they have in more than they've had in in years past, but but I just think that they're more of a run first team. So that and just I kind of like the other receiving cores better in this offense. So I kind of put them at 4. So at 3 I got the Steelers. Now the Steelers, they have some question marks with their receiving core as well. I mean, they do have a stud in George Pickens, but I outside of him, there's some questions because they did go and they traded Deontay Johnson, so they need another receiver to step up, and be that number 2. They drafted Roman Wilson out of Michigan, but they brought in other veteran guys. They brought in Van Jefferson, Quez Watkins, Scotty Miller. They got Calvin Austin there, who did make some plays for them last year, but yeah, the receiving core is kind of lacking as well. But with George Pickens, you got a stud there. Last year he had over 1,100 yards receiving. Excuse me. 1,140 yards receiving and 5 touchdowns. And that was with, you had Kenny Pickett starting, you had Mitchell Trubisky starting, and Mason Rudolph. They had a quarterback carousel last year. But despite that, still finished with over 1,000 yards and, put together a nice season. He had that game, that monster game against the Bengals towards the end of the year. Well, really, towards the end of the year, he had a couple of monster games. Even against the Seahawks, too, he had a big game as well. I just wanted to take a look at his stats towards the end of the year. Um, yeah, so against the Bengals, he had 195 yards receiving. Against the Seahawks, he had 131 yards receiving. So yeah, a couple of monster games there. But the interesting thing is against the Ravens, which is what they ended up clinching the playoffs against them when the Ravens just played all their backups in Baltimore. Um, he didn't have a single catch or a single target. He had a carry in the game, but he didn't do anything in that game really. But yeah, those last two games against the Bengals and the Seahawks, he had a couple of monster games. And then early on in the season, had a good game against the Rams, against the Ravens. The first time he had 130 yards receiving, and he also had a touchdown in that game. Had a good game against the Browns, over 100 yards. But yeah, when Mason Rudolph took over, outside of the last game of the season, he played really well. And we'll see now with Russell Wilson and Justin Fields how he does. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of why I put the Steelers ahead of the Ravens a little bit, just because of George Pickens, and maybe if they get Brandon Ayuk, that'll change things as well. But yeah, so I got the Steelers at 3. At 2, I got the Browns. Amari Cooper is their number 1 receiver. They did bring in Jerry Jeudy as well. Elijah Moore was there last year. But yeah, Amari Cooper last year. Amari Cooper is one of the more underrated receivers in the league. Last year, finished with 1,250 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns on 72 receptions. And look at what he had. Similar to George Pickens, you had Deshaun Watson and Joe Flacco, DTR, PJ Walker. You had all these quarterbacks starting, and Amari Cooper still finished with over 1,000 yards. Was productive. Now, you're hoping Deshaun Watson comes back and stays healthy. So, we don't have to go through that again. But it was an impressive season for him. And then you bring in Jerry Jeudy. Last year he had 758 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. You're hoping that maybe the Browns can unlock something with him. They gave him that 3-year extension. So, you're hoping that, he could play well. Because I know he's a player that people are expecting a little bit more from. But that just has not been the case. So, I think he could be okay with the Browns. And then on top of that, you got Elijah Moore. Last year, he had 640 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. So that's your receiving core right there. And then you still got some other guys as well. I know Tillman, the guy they drafted. I think he's going into his second year. So last year, 224 yards receiving. So he's kind of like, I guess he's the number 4 receiver. You got David Bell. I know he had a touchdown, I believe, last year, late in the season. Yeah, that was against the Jaguars. He had a couple of touchdowns against the Bengals in the final game of the regular season. So that's kind of your receiving core. But yeah, I would put them at number 2. And then at number 1, it's kind of no surprise, it's the Bengals, with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. And this could be the last time that we see these two guys playing alongside each other. Both guys are looking for new contracts, and Jamar Chase is going to get his new contract. T. Higgins will get his, just not with the Bengals, most likely. And we're hoping that Joe Burrow can stay healthy this year, because if he can, these two are going to have really good seasons. And, they still, put together good numbers, even with Joe Burrow, not, well, first of all, he didn't start off the year great with the calf injury, but then he got hurt again. But they were still able to put together productive seasons. Jamar Chase last year, 1,216 receiving yards and 7 touchdowns. And then for T. Higgins, he got banged up a little bit last year. He ended up finishing last year with 656 yards receiving and 5 touchdowns. He played in 12 games. But, the previous 2 seasons with Jamar Chase finished with over 1,000 yards. 1,091 receiving yards in 2021, 1,029 receiving yards in 2022. So, I expect them with Burrow. They're going to put up good numbers once again. And then you got some other guys, Jermaine Burton they drafted, Trenton Irwin. There, Joe Burrow is expecting, um, Andre uh, Iosivas. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but the other receiver to have a big year, maybe be that number 3 guy. I hope that's how you pronounce it. But mainly it's because of T. Higgins and Jamar Chase why this is the best receiving core in the division. So, but yeah, just kind of go through it again. Ravens 4, Steelers 3, Browns 2, and the Bengals at 1. Let me know what you guys think though about the rankings for these receiving cores in this division. How would you rank the receiving core for the teams in the AFC North here? So that basically takes us to the end of the show today. Thank you guys for tuning in. We'll be back again on Monday. Make sure to check out all the other shows on the network. We greatly appreciate your viewership every day. Yeah, hope everybody has a good weekend. And enjoy the games if you watch them. And then next week, we got college football starting. And then, or actually, no, 2 weeks we got college football starting. No, actually, it's starting relatively soon. It's next week. Next weekend, I believe. I don't even know. I lose track of the days. But, yeah, so it is, so it does start next week. And then, then we get the real deal of the NFL regular season coming up. You got, so, I mean, that first week is going to be insane because you got, the Ravens and the Chiefs. Then you got the Packers and the Eagles. Then you got college football. And then you got NFL Sunday. So, jam-packed. So, we're getting there slowly but surely. So, yeah, that is all the time we have for today. Once again, thank you guys for tuning in. We'll be back again on Monday, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And until then, I'm Kenneth Grunfelder signing off from the GSMC Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Have a good day, and I will talk to you guys on Monday. Take care.